When the P-47 Thunderbolt first rolled out in 1942, few men in the U.S. Army Air Forces believed it would ever amount to much. It was huge, heavy, and ungainly, a 7-ton milk jug with wings, pilots joked. The British compared it unfavorably to the nimble Spitfire. Even among American pilots, whispers circulated that the Republic Aviation engineers must have gone mad. The war was raging over Europe, and the Luftwaffe ruled the skies with its sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109s and deadly Focke-Wulf 190s. Against them, the Thunderbolt looked more like a flying tank than a fighter. But in 1943, a group of men would prove everyone wrong. They were called the 56th Fighter Group, the first U.S. unit to take the P-47 into combat over Europe. Their leader was Hub Zemke, a Montana-born pilot who had once flown with the Royal Air Force before America entered the war. Zemke was no ordinary commander. He was sharp, disciplined, and believed in one thing above all: teamwork. "We're going to take this brute and make it sing," he told his men. When the 56th arrived in England, morale was mixed. The British teased them. "So, you brought your flying milk cans, eh?" The Luftwaffe pilots, when they first heard of the Thunderbolt, laughed outright. German intelligence reports described it as a heavy bomber escort incapable of dogfighting. The Germans had reason to be confident. They'd faced the best Allied aircraft before and had sent them crashing into the Channel, but they hadn't yet met the P-47 at full throttle. At first, things didn't go well. Early missions over France in the spring of 1943 revealed serious flaws. The Thunderbolt's range was pitiful. It could barely reach the coast before having to turn back. Mechanical issues plagued it. Radios cut out. Engines overheated. And when the Luftwaffe appeared, the German pilots used their superior climb and turn rates to slip behind the big American machines. Zemke knew that dogfighting a Messerschmitt on its terms was suicide. So he changed the rules. Zemke trained his men to use the P-47's strengths, its altitude performance and diving power. The plane's massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine gave it unmatched speed in a dive. "Don't turn with them," Zemke ordered. "Hit fast, hit hard, and climb away." It was brutal and efficient. The P-47's 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns could shred a fighter in a heartbeat. "If you put your sights on him, he's done," pilot Robert Johnson recalled. "You didn't need finesse, you just needed nerve." By June 1943, the 56th Benner Group began scoring victories. On one mission, Johnson's P-47 was ambushed by several FW-190s over northern France. Cannon shells tore into his plane, setting it ablaze. But the Jug refused to die. Even as smoke filled his cockpit, he dove, leveled out, and limped home across the Channel, his aircraft riddled with over 200 bullet holes. He landed safely. The Germans couldn't believe it. They called the Thunderbolt the Iron Plane. Word spread quickly across Luftwaffe squadrons. "Don't waste ammo on the big one. It won't go down easily." But still they mocked it. The German radio propaganda called it the overweight pig of the sky. That would soon change. By the summer of 1943, the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, had turned the Jug into a weapon to be feared. They learned to fight in disciplined, aggressive pairs. They climbed to 30,000 feet, waited for German formations, and then dove in like hawks. The impact was devastating. Focke-Wulfs burst into flames. Messerschmitts scattered. The 56th had begun rewriting the rulebook of air combat. On August 18, 1943, they flew escort for one of the most dangerous raids of the war, the first deep strike on Regensburg and Schweinfurt, targeting German ball-bearing factories. Hundreds of B-17 bombers lumbered across the Channel, vulnerable and slow. Zemke's men guarded them as long as their fuel allowed. When the Luftwaffe attacked in waves, the sky turned into chaos. Contrails twisting like ghosts, tracer fire streaking through the clouds. The 56th shot down dozens of enemy planes before turning for home. Many never made it back. But the message was clear. The Jug could fight. When the surviving pilots landed in England, covered in sweat and smoke, Zemke gathered them on the field. "Gentlemen," he said, "the Germans aren't laughing anymore." By the end of 1943, the 56th Fighter Group had claimed over 200 aerial victories, the highest of any U.S. unit in Europe. The once mocked P-47 had earned its new name, the Juggernaut of the Skies. By early 1944, the skies over Europe had changed. What had once been the Luftwaffe's domain was now contested ground. The 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, had carved a name for itself. They weren't just pilots anymore, they were hunters. Each man carried a hardened edge born from survival. And at the heart of the group's growing legend stood a man whose name would become synonymous with the P-47, Francis Gabby Gabreski. Gabreski was a Polish-American from Oil City, Pennsylvania, sharp-featured, brash, and fiercely competitive. Before joining the 56th, he'd already seen war firsthand. He had flown with the Polish squadrons of the Royal Air Force after Germany invaded Poland in 1939. Gabby had seen what the Nazis had done to his people. For him, this wasn't just another war, it was personal. When he joined Zemke's unit, he carried that fire with him, and it burned bright. By January 1944, the 56th was flying deep escort missions for B-17 flying fortresses, protecting them on their perilous journeys into the heart of the Reich. The Thunderbolt still suffered from limited range, but new drop tanks had extended its reach. For the first time, American fighters could follow the bombers far beyond the French coast, to Frankfurt, to Hanover, even toward Berlin itself. The Luftwaffe's hunting grounds were shrinking. On February 20th, 1944, the start of Big Week, the 56th Fighter Group flew multiple sorties against Germany's industrial backbone. It was a brutal series of days meant to crush the Luftwaffe once and for all. The air was thick with smoke and contrails as Gabreski led his squadron toward Brunswick. Below, flak burst like black flowers in the sky. Ahead, the German response came, swarms of Bf-109s and FW-190s clawing upward to defend their homeland. The radio crackled, "Bandits, 12 o'clock high." Gabreski dove first. The Thunderbolt roared like thunder as it hurtled downward. The 8.50 caliber Browning spat fire, and a Messerschmitt disintegrated in midair. Gabby pulled up through the smoke, heart pounding. He could hear Zemke's calm voice over the radio. "Stay disciplined, Wolfpack. Hit and climb. Don't linger." Below them, the bomber stream lumbered on. For every German that slipped through, another P-47 dove to intercept. The sky was chaos, swirling contrails, black puffs of flak, and the flash of tracer rounds. But the Luftwaffe was bleeding. For the first time, German pilots began to feel something they hadn't felt before: fear. They had underestimated the Thunderbolt. German intelligence officers had once joked that it was too big to turn, too heavy to climb. But now, their own aces, men like Adolf Galland, were warning that the P-47 was lethal in the hands of skilled pilots. Its dive speed was unmatched. If a Jug got above you, you were dead. One German pilot reportedly said after a dogfight, "You hear the engines roar, and then nothing. The next second, your wingman explodes." Gabreski quickly became one of the deadliest of them all. He flew with precision and fury, tallying kill after kill. FW-190s, ME-109s, even the new twin-engine ME-410s. He used the Jug's weight like a weapon, diving out of the sun, spraying short, devastating bursts. By spring, he had claimed his 20th aerial victory, making him America's leading ace in the European theater. The Germans gave the 56th Fighter Group a nickname, Die Wolfspacke, the Wolf Pack. Their emblem, a snarling wolf's head,
was painted proudly on the cowlings of their aircraft. Every German pilot in Western Europe knew it. When they saw the silver flashes of P-47s diving through the clouds, they braced for impact. Luftwaffe radio chatter became frantic. Achtung! Thunderbolts! High at 10 o'clock! But the Wolfpack paid a heavy price. Missions grew longer, the Luftwaffe more desperate. German pilots now flew with less training, but with reckless courage. The introduction of the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter was looming, and the Allies could sense the shift. Every day over Germany was a gamble with death. The cold bit through flight suits. Flak shredded aircraft with no warning. Many never returned, their names marked simply as missing in action. On May 28, 1944, Gabreski's luck nearly ran out. During a strafing run over a German airfield, his P-47 was hit by flak. Shrapnel ripped through the fuselage, slicing his oxygen line. He barely made it back across the channel, half conscious, blood pooling in his lap. When he climbed out of his battered Jug, ground crews stared in disbelief. "You're hit bad, Gabby," one shouted. He just grinned, limping toward the mess hall. "I'm fine," he said, "but I think the Luftwaffe's having a worse day than I am." By the summer of 1944, the Allies were preparing for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. The 56th was tasked with clearing the skies over France, strafing airfields, trains, and convoys to cripple German mobility. The Jug's heavy armor made it ideal for ground attack. Zemke's pilots dove on enemy columns, unleashing hell. 8.50 caliber guns tore through trucks and tanks alike. "We didn't just fly fighters, we flew flying artillery," Robert Johnson later recalled. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Wolfpack soared over the beaches of Normandy. The sight below was unforgettable. Thousands of ships, endless smoke, and the roar of war like a living thing. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. The once proud German air arm had been shattered. In the days that followed, the P-47s hunted what remained. Fuel trains, retreating convoys, scattered remnants of an empire falling apart. That summer, Gabreski shot down his 28th and final aircraft. Just weeks later, on July 20, 1944, fate caught up with him. While strafing a German airfield, his propeller clipped the ground. He crash-landed, was captured, and spent the rest of the war as a POW. His reign as America's top ace had ended, but his legend had already been written. Back in England, Zemke looked out over the tarmac, the evening sun glinting off rows of battle-worn Thunderbolts. He murmured, "We've come a long way from the days they laughed at us." And they had. By mid-1944, the 56th Fighter Group had destroyed more enemy aircraft in the air than any other unit in the 8th Air Force. The Germans were no longer laughing. They were surviving, barely.
The summer of 1944 had changed everything. The Allies had landed in France. Paris was free. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe's skies, was bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Yet, for the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, the war was far from over. By autumn, the war had taken on a new face. Gone were the massive dogfights over the Channel and northern France. Now the battle was pushing toward Germany itself, a grinding, relentless campaign through hedgerows, villages, and forests. And while the P-51 Mustang had begun taking over long-range escort missions, the P-47 Thunderbolt found its true purpose in the mud and smoke of the front lines. The big, rugged Jug was no longer mocked, it was feared. When Hub Zemke was reassigned to command the 479th Fighter Group in August, leadership of the 56th passed to Colonel David C. Schilling, one of Zemke's most aggressive and fearless pilots. Schilling had been with the Wolfpack from the beginning, a daring flyer with a quick grin and nerves of steel. If Zemke had been the tactician, Schilling was the predator. You don't win wars by playing safe. You win them by hitting hard and not giving the enemy time to breathe. By late 1944, the 56th was operating from newly captured airfields in France.
Their Thunderbolts thundered low over enemy lines, strafing trains, columns, and airfields. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, but what remained still struck with venom. The Germans were desperate, launching last-ditch attacks to slow the Allied advance. The Wolfpack's missions grew more dangerous by the day. One of the most infamous came on December 16, 1944, the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge. Under cover of snow and fog, the German army launched a massive counterattack through the Ardennes forest, smashing into the thinly held American lines. For days, the weather grounded Allied aircraft. The skies over Belgium were silent, the perfect conditions for the German advance. Then, on December 23rd, the clouds finally broke. At dawn, the 56th Fighter Group took to the air. The world below was white, snow-draped forests, shattered villages, columns of smoke. The radio crackled with urgency. Convoys sighted near Bastogne, armor heading west, hit 'em. Schilling led the charge, his P-47 diving through flak and tracer fire. The Jug came alive again in its element, low, fast, and savage. Each aircraft carried bombs, rockets, and thousands of rounds of .5 caliber ammunition. The pilot screamed down over German columns, releasing ordnance with precision born from months of combat. Trucks erupted in fireballs, tanks were flipped like toys, men scattered beneath the roaring engines. For hours, the Thunderbolts tore the German advance apart. The Luftwaffe tried to respond, but their numbers were thin and their fuel supplies dwindling. A handful of Focke-Wulf 19s appeared, attacking from the sun. One came in on Schilling's tail, a flash of cannon fire, a trail of smoke. Schilling rolled hard, dove to the deck, and pulled a brutal turn that nearly tore his wings off. He reversed, climbed, and fired. The German fighter exploded in midair, its flaming wreckage tumbling into the snow below. "Scratch 119, Schilling said calmly over the radio. "Wolfpack, keep hunting." The next day, the 56th flew again and again. Their targets were endless: supply trains, bridges, tanks, artillery positions. The Thunderbolt's armor made it nearly invincible at low altitude. Pilots returned with wings shredded from flak and holes big enough to crawl through, yet they kept flying. Ground crews joked that the P-47 wasn't made of aluminum, but sheer stubbornness. On December 26th, Captain Glenn Eggleston of the 353rd Squadron led a flight over the Meuse River. Below, they spotted a column of Panther tanks trying to retreat east. "Let's clean it up," he called. The Jugs dove, guns blazing. The .5s raked through the convoy, detonating ammunition trucks and fuel tenders. Flames leapt hundreds of feet high. By the time they pulled away, the road was nothing but burning steel. The men on the ground began calling the Thunderbolt the Angel of Death. But it wasn't just the Germans who were in awe. American infantrymen pinned down in foxholes would look up at the sound of those radial engines and cheer. "That's our boys," they'd shout, watching the big fighters swoop in to obliterate enemy positions. Many GIs later said the sight of the P-47 diving through flak was the most beautiful thing they had ever seen. As 1944 turned to 1945, the German counter-offensive collapsed. The bulge was shrinking. The 56th Fighter Group had flown hundreds of sorties in those frozen weeks, crippling enemy supply lines and saving countless Allied troops on the ground. But even as the Allies pushed east, the Luftwaffe wasn't quite finished. In January 1945, they launched Operation Bodenplatte, a surprise New Year's Day assault on Allied airfields across Western Europe. Hundreds of German fighters streaked in at treetop level, hoping to destroy the Allied air forces on the ground. At Boxted Airfield, where the 56th was stationed, the attack came just after dawn. The ground crews were fueling aircraft when the sirens wailed. Within moments, the air was filled with the roar of engines and the rattle of machine guns. Focke-Wulf 19 swooped low, strafing parked Thunderbolts and hangars. But the Wolfpack was ready. Pilots sprinted for their planes, some taking off through smoke and debris. Schilling himself taxied through burning fuel tanks and lifted into the fight. The sky became a deadly carousel, Jugs and Focke-Wulfs twisting and firing at point-blank range. In the chaos, Lieutenant Walter Beckham, a rising ace, shot down 2 attackers before his own aircraft exploded in flames. His loss hit the group hard, but the counterattack was swift and decisive. Within minutes, the 56th had turned the tables, chasing the Germans back across the channel. When the smoke cleared, dozens of wrecked Focke-Wulf 19s lay scattered across the countryside. The German gamble had failed. The Luftwaffe had burned its last reserves of fuel and men. The 56th Fighter Group had survived, bloodied, exhausted, but unbroken. As the snow melted in early 1945, Schilling gathered his men on the flight line. Rows of P-47 stood behind him, their paint scorched, their guns still warm from battle. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "this war is ending, but history will remember who owned these skies." The men of the 56th nodded. They'd been laughed at once, called fools for flying a fat fighter that no one wanted. But now, as the shattered remains of the Luftwaffe burned below, everyone knew the truth. The Jug was king.
By early 1945, the world was crumbling for Nazi Germany. The Reich that once stretched from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow was collapsing under Allied fire. Cities lay in ruins, rail lines were shattered. Oil, the blood of the Luftwaffe, had all but vanished. Yet even as the Third Reich fell apart, the men of the 56th Fighter Group still strapped themselves into their Thunderbolts and took to the sky. The war wasn't over yet, and the Wolfpack wasn't about to slow down. The winter of 1945 was cruel. The airfields across Belgium and Holland were seas of mud and ice, the kind that froze engines solid overnight. Mechanics worked with numb fingers to keep the P-47s flying. The men were exhausted, physically and mentally, but their mission had changed. The Luftwaffe was no longer a great air armada. It was a wounded animal fighting for survival. Now, the Thunderbolts hunted what was left of it. Every morning, Schilling's pilots went aloft, sweeping low over Germany's broken heartland. Their targets weren't enemy fighters anymore. They were trains, convoys, and anything that moved. The P-47 had become the ultimate ground attack aircraft, a flying sledgehammer. Each mission blurred into the next, long flights over forests and towns, the smell of cordite in the cockpit, the earth below erupting in fire and steel. One mission in February 1945 stood out. Captain Charles Morley and his flight spotted a railway yard near Bonn. Smoke was already curling from a nearby oil depot. The RAF had bombed it the night before, but trains were still running. Morley called over the radio, "Wolfpack, let's clean it up." They rolled in one after another, guns blazing. The .50 calibers tore through boxcars, detonating hidden munitions. The explosions shook the air. When they climbed away, the entire yard was a sheet of flame, visible for miles. German civilians later said the sound of the Thunderbolt's radial engines haunted them, a deep, growling rumble that meant destruction was coming. To the Wehrmacht soldiers retreating through the Rhineland, the Jug was death from above. Still, the enemy fought on. Even in its dying days, the Luftwaffe sent up its remnants, mostly teenagers and veterans flying outdated aircraft. Occasionally, a new Messerschmitt Me-262 jet would streak through the sky, faster than anything the Americans had ever seen. But the 56th adapted quickly. Schilling's men learned to attack the jets as they took off or landed, where their speed advantage vanished. On one mission in March, Captain Raymond Wetmore, already an ace, caught an Me-262 trying to climb away from an airfield near Kassel. He dove hard, fired a long burst, and watched the jet explode before it reached altitude. By then, Wetmore had become the group's new superstar. At 21 years old, he would finish the war with 21.25 aerial victories, making him the top-scoring ace of the 56th Fighter Group. His calm precision and boyish grin hid a deadly instinct. When reporters later asked how he managed so many kills, he simply said, "The Jug never let me down." As the Allied armies crossed the Rhine in March, the Wolfpack followed close behind. The 56th shifted to advanced bases in Belgium, flying missions that seemed almost routine, if anything in war could ever be routine. Every sortie meant dodging flak, engine failures, and weather that could kill as surely as enemy fire. Yet morale remained high. The Wolfpack had become a brotherhood, forged in fire, bound by loss. Many of their original comrades were gone. Gabreski was still in a POW camp. Walter Beckham, Walker Mahurin, Gerald Johnson, all captured or killed. Even Hub Zemke, the father of the Wolfpack, had been shot down in a B-17 while returning from a mission as a passenger. He too became a prisoner of war. But their spirit endured. Every man who climbed into a P-47 carried the legacy of those who'd come before. In April 1945, as the Allied armies crossed the Elbe River, the 56th flew one of its last major missions, a sweep across central Germany to destroy remaining airfields and transport hubs. The war was nearly over, but no one wanted to be the last man killed. The radio chatter that morning was subdued. The pilots spoke quietly, their voices steady. Over a small town near Magdeburg, they found one final target, a convoy of trucks fleeing east. The Jugs dove together, wings glittering in the pale spring sun. The lead truck exploded, sending smoke curling up through the trees. The air was filled with the familiar rattle of machine guns and the deep thunder of the P-47 engine. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. Silence returned to the German countryside. When the Wolfpack landed that afternoon, ground crews handed out letters and cigarettes. Schilling stood at the edge of the runway, watching the sun set over the rows of battered Thunderbolts. Some bore more than 100 patches from bullet holes. Others had entire panels replaced after flak damage. But they'd all made it home. Just weeks later, on May 8, 1945, VE Day, the war in Europe officially ended. The men of the 56th Fighter Group celebrated quietly. There were no cheers or parades on the airfield that night, only a kind of exhausted relief. Some drank in silence. Others walked among the parked Jugs, running their hands along the fuselages like saying goodbye to an old friend. In just over 2 years of combat, the 56th Fighter Group had destroyed 1,006 enemy aircraft in the air and hundreds more on the ground, more than any other American fighter group in the European theater. They had done it, flying the plane everyone once laughed at. After the war, many of the Wolfpack's pilots went on to shape the future of the U.S. Air Force. Schilling would fly again in Korea before dying in a 1956 car crash. Zemke returned home a hero and later commanded the Air Defense Command. Gabreski would become one of America's few triple-ace pilots, scoring kills in both World War II and Korea. And the P-47 Thunderbolt? It faded quietly from frontline service, replaced by sleek new jet fighters. But its legend never died. In museums and air shows, its massive frame still gleams under the light, a reminder of a time when raw power, courage, and grit decided the fate of nations. In the end, the Germans had been wrong. The flying milk jug they once mocked had become the hammer that broke the Luftwaffe's back. As one surviving pilot of the Wolfpack said years later, standing beside a restored P-47 with silver hair and misted eyes, "They laughed at us in '43. They weren't laughing in '45.